Hello everybody. In this presentation, I'll talk about the role scholasticism in traditional education play in Muslim societies and how scholasticism and traditional education have been influencing modern higher education. The discussions are based on the review of theoretical frameworks as well as analysis of interview data from my fieldwork conducted in Pakistan and Tajikistan. I begin this presentation by talking about the definition of scholasticism in general and Islamic scholasticism in particular. Highlighting the issues with these definitions, I propose that the general characteristics of scholasticism identified by José Ignacio Cabezón are very helpful when exploring scholasticism comparatively. Then I will argue that scholasticism and traditional education survive in Muslim context to a large extent and have an influence on the societies as well as modern higher educational institutions. Scholasticism is often understood in its European sense, which according to Encyclopaedia Britannica is philosophical systems and speculative tendencies of various medieval Christian thinkers, who against the backdrop of fixed religious dogma sought to solve new general philosophical problems of faith and reason, will and intellect, existence of God, etc. Close to European understanding is George Makdisi's definition of Islamic scholasticism. Makdisi thinks only Muslim legal scholars can be considered as the true Islamic scholastics. He argues that it were Muslim legal scholars who laid the foundation of scholasticism and who were predecessors to European Christian scholastics. He believes that the scholarly system of determining orthodoxy started with Muslim laymen putting a question to a jurist consult, asking for a response or legal opinion. The latter then researched the question in the sacred scriptures, exerting ijtihad or independent thinking and using one's efforts to its limit. However, there are problems with the European understanding of scholasticism and Makdisi's definition of Islamic scholasticism. Both are rather narrow definitions when considering other scholastic traditions or even exploring various intellectual trends within the same tradition. Therefore, José Ignacio Cabezón's framework is very useful for our purpose here. Cabezón invites us to pay attention to both similarities and differences when dealing with conceptual categories, and to realize that these categories are subject to change when encountering what's culturally other. It then requires a kind of and reconstruction of meanings embodied in the now modified and necessarily more complex category. Exploring Buddhist scholasticism, which was as a result of comparison and dialogical interaction with the European scholastic tradition, Cabezón frees scholasticism from its parochial association as a European intellectual movement and suggests instead a notion of scholasticism that, now more broadly construed, could serve as a preliminary locus for the comparative and cross-cultural analysis of a variety of other traditions. Admitting that not all traditions may be called scholastic, Cabezón believes that the characteristics found in his study of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism could be central to many other traditions and that they could serve as a starting point for a broader conversation about the category of scholasticism as an interpretative option to scholars of other traditions. So these broad characteristics of scholasticism that Cabezón identifies are a strong sense of tradition, a concern with language, proliferativity, the tendency to textual and analytical inclusivity rather than exclusivity, completeness and compactness, the epistemological accessibility of the world, systematicity, order in exposition, commitment to rationalism, self-reflexivity, the tendency to objectify and critically analyze the first-order practices. Madigan adds to Islamic scholastics Mutazila theologians or Mutakallimun too. He suggests for the definition of scholasticism by Cabezón to be amended because he thinks that in order to include into the working definition of scholasticism the judicial theologians, something of this guild school aspect of scholasticism should be considered, or the teaching and definition functions as being at the heart of scholasticism. So for Madigan, philosophers, mystics, and scholars belonging to various traditions in Islam are not part of Islamic scholasticism because he thinks that they did not search for the truth. Thus both Makdisi and Madigan tend to delimit the borders of Islamic scholasticism to Islamic legal scholars only and neglect the contribution of other intellectual traditions in Islam. However, it's not very clear why Madigan is so eager to include Mutakallimun into the ranks of scholastics, yet considers the works of Avicenna, Averroes, and other Muslim philosophers as being marginal to the central concern of Muslim community, and that this kind of intellectual endeavour is not to be considered the Islamic equivalent of scholasticism. However, I think after all the Mutakallimun too remained marginal on Islam's intellectual map. Is marginality sufficient to exclude certain Muslim intellectuals from scholastic tradition? I contend that the works of Muslim scholars such as Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Abu Yaqub Sijistani, Nasir Khosraw, Mullah Sadra, and many more have dealt with central concerns of Muslim community. Moreover, I think these thinkers did search for the truth with an intellectual agenda and whose works can be tested against the major characteristics of scholasticism defined by Cabezon. So there are two major problems with Makdisi and Madigan approach. Firstly, they assume that the legal theologians and their guild schools were operating completely freely without any interference from politics or ideologies of the time. Secondly, they think that legal theologians were the only scholars who perfected the art of teaching and practiced independent thinking. So in light of these deficiencies, there is a need for a broader understanding of Islamic scholasticism, so that it includes philosophers, mystics, and scholars of Shia tradition. Arguably, in light of Cabezon's broader characteristics of scholasticism, the heritage of philosophers, Shia scholars, and mystics need to be explored at a deeper level to enrich the understanding of Islamic scholasticism. Secondly, I think most of these traditions are still alive among some Muslims. For example, the heritage of Ibn Sina is alive amongst Persian speakers, and the legacy of Nasir Khosraw is practiced amongst Ismaili Muslims of Central Asia. Let us have a look at some examples of how scholasticism trickles down to the level of ordinary Muslims and how it is kept alive by them. When conducting fieldwork in Badakhshan, Tajikistan, I came across an illiterate man who showed me a bundle of books with a copy of the Holy Quran, the Wajidin of Nasir Khosraw, and one or two books of poetry, which he carefully wrapped in a white cloth and kept in the upper shelf of a cabinet. He even safeguarded the rooftop and put thorny branches on the spot so that nobody would step over them. He had highest regard for these books and was fluently conversant in prophetic narratives, philosophy, and poetry of Nasir Khosraw, Jalaluddin Rumi, and Hafiz. Still, he insisted that he was an ignorant person. But my further persistence as to where and how he learned his knowledge revealed that he gained it by attending religious ceremonies, which often last the entire night when somebody passes away in Badakhshan. And listening to these discussions and debates and sermons there, this man got his education. Such examples are not uncommon in that context. When I interviewed Nadim Omar Tarar in Pakistan, he specifically highlighted how in Muslim history reading and writing were not the only means to transmit knowledge. Rather, it was the spoken word, which was a much more popular method than normal reading and writing. He stated that amongst Muslim vast body of knowledge was transmitted via oral means, poems, song, performances, calligraphy, and other forms of art. Paul Griffiths highlights four principal components of scholasticism: scholastic reading, scholastic composition, scholastic epistemological commitment, and their institutional context. According to him, scholastic reading is attitudinal, cognitive, and moral, and does not require written objects and technical skills of deriving meaning from them. That's why I think the illiterate man we discussed earlier is able to read and gain meaning from these scholastic discourses. Muslims very often read the Holy Quran and philosophical poetry from their memories on a daily basis. Or, as Griffith will put it, for such readers the ideally read text is the memorized text. Thus, scholastic and intellectual traditions in Muslim contexts trickle down to the level of a layman through private education, apprenticeship, and informal education, and methods such as reading and writing, memorization, recitation of sacred texts and poetry, storytelling and literature, calligraphy, painting, music and dance, pilgrimage, seeing, smelling and experiencing. In contemporary times, we can see how traditional modes of knowledge transmission have been marginalized, but at the same time we can see that this marginalization did not stop the role and influence of scholastic and traditional education either at the level of societies or higher education. Traditional education in forms of madrasahs or informal private settings still play a role and do have influence both positive and negative in societies. The negative impact, as my findings revealed, are mostly due to global politics of our times that force some madrasas to become militant, for example, in Pakistan. We know that Muslims borrowed a lot from European structures of higher education in the 19th and 20th centuries. So despite marginalization of scholasticism and traditional higher learning, there have been many exchanges of ideas and interactions taking place between scholastic traditions and modern higher education. However, we know very little about the impact indigenous structures of higher learning had on modern higher education. In my research, I have categorized the influences of traditional education on modern education. I think scholasticism and traditional education penetrated into modern higher education via employment, institutional exchanges, because Muslims had long-standing tradition of higher learning, and via Muslims' cultural awakening since the late 19th century, but especially since the 1970s. Scholars I interviewed in Pakistan highlighted that some best values of knowledge acquisition of the madrasas, mosques, Sufi lodges, khanaqahs, jamaat khanas, the tombs of saints have been transferred from traditional to modern education. For instance, these are the lessons that traditional models of higher learning have been offering. These are high regard and respect for knowledge, teaching approaches like memorization, recitation and reading, holistic development of a person, and human values such as regard for teachers, elders, women and children, relations between human and their built environment, close relationship between students and teachers, and importance of becoming first a good human being and then a professional. So we can conclude that despite being marginalized, scholastic traditions did not lose their functions and values in societies. Not only scholasticism and traditional institutions largely survived the modern pressures for reforms, but they influenced modern higher educational institutions greatly, thus drawing a sharp dichotomy between modern and traditional education is perhaps a moot point. Additionally, although there is limited awareness about the values of traditional education and its positive impact upon modern higher education, not everything is lost, and Muslims do have enormous opportunities to coherently, constructively build upon their heritage. Thank you.